Our program tonight is going to be presented by John Dew. Starting life as a preacher's kid, John is a lifelong Methodist. We sometimes call those cradle Methodists, but he actually started before the cradle, as his father served on the General Board of Education in Nashville and the Board of Global Ministries in New York. John was confirmed at Calvary Methodist Church in 1964 in Nashville. He is a graduate of Kentucky Wesleyan, which is a United Methodist college, now in the Kentucky Conference. He has been a member of 11 different United Methodist churches with a total of 25 different pastors, covering an area of 6 annual conferences. Not surprisingly, he has served on just about every possible committee you can be on in a local church, which as a Methodist, you know, that is a lot of committees. He has served as an MYF counselor, an adult Sunday school teacher, and has chaired the board for the Wesley Foundation at the University of Alabama. So his bona fides as a Methodist pretty much encapsulate several lifetimes. He has also held leadership positions with affiliates of Habitat for Humanity in Paducah, Kentucky, and in Troy and Tuscaloosa here in Alabama. John is devoted to helping the United Methodist Church continue to serve as a big tent denomination and to become more inclusive. And now John Dew will present our program tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. I've been asked to give a talk on the United Methodist Church today. And so we're going to bring up some PowerPoint slides that we'll be able to take a look at in terms of this presentation. So let's see, I want to start by asking us to go back to 1968 for a moment. It was a time of optimism, a time of a new hope for our church when we had this merger between the Methodists and the EUB, and it created a big tent during a time of great turmoil in the nation. The country went through an awful lot of stress throughout the 1960s. Within this new denomination, this United Methodist Church, there would be room for some differences on some issues. We were pretty straightforward in welcoming pluralism and diversity. There was a very strong commitment to addressing issues of racism in the church. We were in the process of welcoming women into leadership positions. There was, in this 1968 quadrennial, a major theme on reconciliation. And the church approved a major fund for reconciliation. It was about a $50 million budget to be spent over several years. So we start by looking back and thinking about where we were in that point in time. Now let's move on and talk a little bit about the reality of being part of a big tent. The church as it was formed included many different people. It included conservatives and those who were fundamentalists. You might recall from the 1960s, the silent majority, many of them were Methodists. There were folks who would view themselves as middle of the road, some who thought of themselves as liberals, some who were very focused on social justice issues. And there were lots of baby boomers. And I want to remind you, particularly if you are a baby boomer, that this was the first generation that came along with the MYF, or what then became the UMYF. First time the church was seriously reaching out to teenagers and challenging them. And I think they raised a whole lot of expectations about where the church was going to be going. Well, it wasn't long before we began to see some pushback on this pluralism and pushback on these social justice issues. And there were a lot of questions being raised. In Texas, they wanted to know, well, why are we helping the farm workers? And in the Plains, they wanted to know, why are we helping the Oglala Sioux? And many other questions like this. There was pushback on accepting women and minorities in leadership positions in many different congregations. Some churches in these days withheld their apportionments because of the Fund for Reconciliation, the actions that were being taken forward there. Some folks resented the Black College Fund and other types of social justice initiatives. And there began to be new expressions of concern about the question of sexual orientation. So let's kind of focus in on this question of sexual orientation, which at that point in time we referred to as homosexuality. The General Conference in 1972 added the thought of homosexuality being incompatible with Christian teaching. Subsequent General Conferences have become battlegrounds, resulting in additional prohibitions against clergy regarding the conduct of same-sex marriages or the ordination of self-avowed practicing homosexuals, and funding of any kind of educational resources that include the topic of homosexuality. Well, while that's going on in the 1970s and into the 1980s, medical and psychological research is coming to see sexuality as an orientation, not as a choice. So the church was in the process of becoming discriminatory, and the discrimination was extended to a lot of different issues where LGBTQ people could not serve in local churches or in denominational leadership. They were sometimes not accepted as members. Their children might be rejected from church choirs and other kinds of activities. And it was creating, and still creates, a fundamental conflict with John Wesley's first rule, do no harm. So from this issue of the harm being done emerged a group, the Reconciling Ministries Network. And it was formed in the 1980s. And for many clergy and congregations, the question of sexual orientation was just not widely discussed. Many clergy were quietly ministering to their LGBTQ members, but it wasn't an issue that was getting lots and lots of discussion at church council meetings and administrative boards and so forth. RMN worked to connect people with churches that would be safe and that truly offered open hearts, open minds, and open doors. And RMN, as it developed, advocates for intersectional justice, the idea of justice regarding issues related to gender and race, and also including LGBTQ people. So for many years as well during this time, LGBTQ people who were called to ministry or felt called to leadership have been silenced and in many cases prohibited from following God's calls. And at the same time, the nation suffered the AIDS epidemic. And the way that was discussed in the media and even by some political leaders was very accusatory toward the gay and lesbian community, and was reflected, I think, within the United Methodist Church as well. However, subsequent court cases legalized same-sex marriage, and this has brought the issue very much out into the open. The RMN, from our position, wants to remain in the United Methodist Church and to help our church become more inclusive. So on the one hand, we have the RMN organization, but a few years ago, we saw the emergence of the Wesley Covenant Association. This group is very closely aligned with Asbury Theological Seminary. And in their literature and on their website, they will use terms to describe themselves as orthodox, or as conservative, or as traditional, or Wesleyan, or Orthodox Wesleyan, all sorts of different combinations there. But many would perceive their basic doctrine as being fundamentalist. They have issues, in some cases, with the appointment process. They raise questions regarding the authority of bishops. There are questions that they are raising related to apportionments and how apportionments are spent. And it is specifically exclusive of LGBTQ people and their role within the Methodist Church. Now, when you read their literature, you'll find that initially they were hoping that they would be able to provide guidance for the future direction of our denomination, but they recognized early on that might not be the case. So from an early position, they saw that their intent was probably to lead a break-off movement from the United Methodist Church. And so they have been advocating and fundraising for what they would call a global Methodist Church. And part of their activities are clearly designed to mobilize to take entire conferences out of the United Methodist Church. And we're about to have their 5th global gathering here in Montgomery, Alabama. It will be at Fraser United Methodist Church coming up within just a few days. Now, a little bit more we might think about related to the WCA. They are intertwined with a publication called Good News that positions itself as Orthodox Wesleyan Christianity, but it is also, and has been for many years, a fundamentalist movement within the United Methodist Church, going back to 1968. And this issue of positioning oneself as traditionalist or Orthodox, conservative in some way is very important in terms of the conversation that we're having, because it's done to create a view that this is the majority of the view of most United Methodists, when in reality there may be really not that many that are aligned in this direction. But they do conduct workshops for United Methodist clergy on how to position their congregations, to prepare their congregations for leaving the United Methodist Church. One of the groups that they hold up as a model that they advocate that people should study is the Orchid Church in Tupelo, Mississippi. They left the United Methodist Church in 2017, but they are viewed as a model for disaffiliation. And when we take a look at the fifth global gathering coming up at Fraser in a few days, the keynote speakers, one will be the president of Asbury Theological Seminary, and the other will be the senior pastor at the Orchid Church in Tupelo. So this is definitely the focus of this conference, how to get ready to leave the United Methodist Church, what's worked well for Orchid, and other reasons why you should be planning to separate. So let's move on to the question of separation and plans that might be made. In 2016, there was a commission that was formed known as the Way Forward Commission, and they developed 3 different plans for how the church might proceed. In 2019, there was a special session of the General Conference that was called, and the WCA at that time was pushing for more restrictions on clergy and on restrictions on conducting gay or lesbian marriages. The General Conference special session passed the traditional plan by a very narrow margin. And in part, those who were with the WCA were hoping that non-WCA congregations and churches would leave, but that did not turn out to be the case. The special session did approve the current options for disaffiliation of the churches, and it reinforced restrictions on clergy regarding conducting marriages. So there was, in July of 2019, a mediation group that was formed. It was kind of ad hoc, and the purpose seemed to be to come up with a good strategy to enable WCA churches to leave the United Methodist Church and to be able to leave with their property and resources intact. This group developed what is called the Negotiated Protocol for Reconciliation and Grace through Separation. And the intent was that this was going to be presented at the General Conference in 2020. But that conference, as we all know, was postponed due to COVID-19, and it was moved to 2021, postponed again. So no action has been taken on the protocol, and the church's Judicial Council has refused to rule on the constitutionality of this proposal regarding the right of an entire annual conference to leave the United Methodist Church. So that leaves us at this point in time inching towards 2022 or 2024. The draft protocol would enable WCA and other churches to separate with their property. And under the draft protocol, a United Methodist Church would remain, and that church could become more inclusive and head off things such as clergy trials. But it's not clear that the General Conference will happen in 2022, or that the current draft of the protocol will be found by the church's Judicial Council to be constitutional. No vote can be taken on the protocol until General Conference convenes at the earliest of August 2022, and it's not clear that if a vote were taken that the protocol would pass. It's also open as to whether or not there might be amendments proposed for the protocol as well. Meanwhile, there are 2 paths currently open for separation for a congregation. A congregation can close as a United Methodist Church and then purchase the property and the assets that congregation held if the conference agrees. Or second pathway, which is almost the same thing, a congregation can petition a conference to disaffiliate, but they have to cover associated costs, pension liabilities, etc. And in 2020, 54 conferences approved the disaffiliation of 51 congregations. So from that, let's think a little bit more about this question of disaffiliation. 3 United Methodist churches in Maine and 1 in Houston, Texas, have recently disaffiliated out of solidarity with their LGBTQ members because they believe that the United Methodist Church will not ever become more inclusive. Others, on the other hand, are requesting to disaffiliate because they think that 2022 General Conference will not approve the protocols, and they don't want to wait any longer, and they may certainly not want to wait till 2024. Meanwhile, the WCA has established a transitional leadership council. You can read about it on their website, and it is at work, and it is suggesting, amongst other possibilities, that congregations could deed their property to the Global Methodist Church. At this point in time, some WCA churches are refusing to accept new appointments from their bishops. Some are refusing to pay apportionments, and some are threatening to prosecute pastors outside of their conferences even, who may conduct gay or lesbian weddings. So it's getting a little bit more interesting. We are in essence now living in what we might think of as between times, because no one really knows how this is going to go forward. We are waiting for the General Conference in August of 2022 or 2024. Some United Methodist churches are disaffiliating where their conference will concur and allow them to do so. But I want to emphasize that there are no proposals to change basic United Methodist Church doctrines and standards regarding the Trinity, the Lordship of Christ, the virgin birth, the bodily resurrection, or the primacy of Scripture, despite some claims to that effect being made by the WCA. The essentials of our faith and the general rules will remain the same in the United Methodist Church. Now, until and if the General Conference votes on the protocol, we don't really know much more. We continue on day to day in default mode. If the current draft of the protocols were to pass, and if the Judicial Council were to rule it constitutional, annual conferences could vote to leave the United Methodist Church, but churches could vote to stay in the United Methodist Church. And if an annual conference voted to stay in the United Methodist Church, individual churches or congregations could be allowed to vote to leave. But who knows? That's 2022 at the earliest. It may be 2024. It may be that it doesn't come to pass at all. And in the meantime, there is the discussion of what could be a new regional conference that might be created for the United States. And this might allow for contextualizing the Book of Discipline that would allow for interpretation based upon the geographic norms of a particular area. Legislation like the Christmas Covenant might lead us to this, but we're going to stop this evening there with the Christmas Covenant and this idea of contextualizing and pick that back up in a later presentation over the next couple of weeks. So with that, let me turn things back over to Jen here, and we'll talk about breakout groups.